today is going to be, I mentioned Mephibosheth, and the man that was sitting over there, he said, well, I know who Mephibosheth is. Now, Mephibosheth is a difficult name to pronounce, and very few people have heard of it. I was surprised. Has anybody else heard of Mephibosheth? When I was asked a seminary student, graduate there at Brentwood, I said Mephibosheth, and he said, who? I never heard of anybody like that. There's no name like that in the Bible. Now, Mephibosheth is an interesting character. And as I start this morning, I know I'm not going to be able to accomplish my purpose. Because nobody has ever been able to accomplish what I'm going to try to do today. So it's difficult to start a message realizing that you're not going to succeed. Because as I've studied other pastors, they've talked about this subject, they said they just came up short. We're going to talk about the grace and the love of God. And nobody has ever been able to adequately bring a message on the grace of God and the love of God. Everybody comes up short. And so it's difficult to start a message off knowing you're going to come up short. But you got to try. Songs have been written. They've all come up short. But we still sing songs about the love and grace of God. Even though we all come up short. We still sing about them. But we still always come up short and not able to adequately describe it. Describe the grace of God. And so I know at the beginning of this talk that it's not going to be totally perfect. I'm not going to finish it at all, not even come close. But we've got to look at it. We've got to understand it as best as we can. And now the first definition, when I did do some study and research on grace, the first definition of grace that I ran across came from a man named Aristotle. Now that's strange that you would say him, because he lived 300 years before Christ. Now his definition of the grace was, grace is a spontaneous gift given to a friend without any expectation of a return favor. Now that's 300 years before Christ. That's the first definition that I ran into in grace. Now the definition is good, but it comes up way short. Comes up way short. And one other thing that we need to look at is that all the words in the New Testament were in common use at that time. Even the word grace. These were not special words that were developed just for the New Testament. When I was in Greek class and seminary, they said, you know, the Koine Greek was a special language of the New Testament. And I thought, that's strange in my thinking, that why would there be just a language just for the New Testament that nobody else knew? Then I realized that it was a common language. It was just the more colloquial type language, more common language that people would use. It wasn't the erudite, sophisticated, legal type language. It was the normal language of everybody. And so these words were all used in everyday life back then. It's just that when God came in, when God started writing the New Testament and elevating these words were elevated to a level that they had never been elevated before. Grace now is not spontaneous. It was planned from the very foundation of the world. God's love was not something just all of a sudden, just spontaneous. Second is, it wasn't given to just friends. It was given to enemies. To all people were participant in the grace of God. And the second part was true without any expectation of return. God loves everyone. He gives grace is available to everyone without any expectation of return. Now, Christ died for all sinners. Christ died for everyone, but not necessarily expecting that person to respond positively. So, I was talking about the Mephibosheth. Now, this outline is developed from the story of Mephibosheth. And I'll tell you some of where I got the basic outline from. You can look him up. He's got several sermons. There's all kinds of messages on Mephibosheth on the internet if you want to look more and study this topic more from different angles, different points of view. In fact, matter, I was wondering, I don't know how many of you listen to other pastors on the radio or TV, but when I was working over at Liberty Baptist Church down the road, over there on off Nolensville near Woodbine, the majority of the people all listened to Charles Stanley Saturday night. And then they came in and listened to me on Sunday morning, and then they listened to somebody else on Sunday night. And so I was just one among many that they were listening to. Fact of the matter, today, with the studies on the internet, you can almost get a seminary degree without ever setting foot in seminary, with all the Bible studies and everything going on the internet. So, by the way, does anybody listen to anybody? You have a favorite preacher that you like to listen to on the radio?
Max Lucado.
Who?
Max Lucado.
Lucado.
And Stanley.
Stanley.
And also Dr. Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, that's great. Stanley, I like to listen to him. He was a great guy. Well, anyway, here's the basic outline of Mephibosheth. Grace is God loving the unlovely. That is showing up right there. Grace is God giving Christ to die for sinners. Grace is lifting that which cannot be lifted. And grace is illustrated in the story of Mephibosheth. So when we see the story of Mephibosheth, we have a word picture, a visual of what grace is. Now, as we start in this, I am going to violate some of the rules that we learned in seminary on preaching. They say, do not use allegory in your sermons. Don't compare things, do allegory. But the Bible uses allegories. Hagar and Sarah, Paul said it was an allegory of the free and the slave. And so there's going to be a little bit of allegory. I'm not going to go as far as what the fellow that preached this sermon first. He went a little to the extreme. I'll admit, if you listen to him, if you happen to listen to the fellow, I don't go as to the extreme that he does in allegory. But it is a very good illustration of what the grace of God is. First of all, God is loving the unlovely. Now, the next thing I want to try to do this morning is I'm going to go over this rather quickly. And hopefully I can leave 10 minutes maybe at the end, maybe more, maybe a little bit less, for discussion. I like discussion. I like to talk about it. So I hope I'm feeding some thoughts in this, and any problems that you might have along the way, that we'll talk about it. This could be presented as just a straight up sermon, but since I look at this more or less like a Bible study. But the first one is that God loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. God loved this world. He loved us. He loved the unlovely. Now, there's a lot of folks that only love the lovely. This last Sunday, Mike Glenn was trying to preach, and I say trying, he did a good job, and I don't mean to say that he didn't do a good job, but he tried to preach on love, and he came up short. So anybody that preaches on love is going to come up short. But he gave an illustration that he has a very rare blood type. And he said he gets called from Vanderbilt and from the hospital and say, we've got a little baby down here that needs your blood type. Can you come on down? And so he'd go down there and he'll give his rare blood type to that baby. He said, how come you always say it's a little baby down here? He said, because we know that if we tell you that we've got a 60-year-old drug addict smoking on pot and just came out of prison, that we need your rare blood type, you may not come. But we tell you that if we've got a little baby down here, that if you don't come, they're not going to make it. So he said, we know that we can get you down here if we say we got a little baby down here that needs your blood. And we're that way. You know, if somebody needed a kidney, you'd probably give your kidney to a good person, but if you knew that they were living a life of really perverted sin, and you knew that they weren't going to change, you may not decide to give your kidney to that person. But to one of your grandkids or one of your children, your husband or wife, you say, sure, I'll do that for somebody. But I'm kind of selective on who I'm going to donate a kidney to. I'm kind of selective on who I'm going to really risk my life for. But God is totally different. He risked his life, and he gave his life for everybody. Now, I know there's a certain theology out there that says that God only died for the saved, but God died for everybody, regardless of their response. But Ephesians 2, 4 and 5 says, because of his great love for us, who is rich in his mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in our trespasses. It is by grace you have been saved. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Second, grace is God-given Christ to die for unlovely sinners. Romans 5, for scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man some would even dare to die. But God commended his love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. God didn't wait till we were good. God didn't wait for us to be justified before he died for us. And he didn't die for us on the condition that we accept him. He died for us when we were yet sinners. And that's enough to stop and you think about that for a long time and just meditate on God's tremendous. Now, it took me a long time to really even begin to comprehend the love of God. I had a hard time understanding that God loved me. Maybe I was thinking about this. Maybe a narcissistic person could think, well, God loves me. I know God, everybody loves me. God had to love me. He's the first one to ever love me. But there's some of us, when we realize how unlovely we are, it's difficult for us really to comprehend how much God really loved us. Second is, lastly, grace is God lifting that which cannot lift itself. We were in a situation at one time in our life where we could not change. We were helpless. Now, I like this verse in Paul in Ephesians 2:12. Remember that at that time you were separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenant of promise, without hope and without God in the world. Now, some of us have been a Christian so long, we don't really remember what it was like to be without God. But this is the condition of us when we were without God, without hope, no hope. Perhaps the hardest words in the English language say there's no hope. Without hope, there's no hope. I know they keep telling me that this procedure that I'm going to have next Tuesday, said that doctors make it sound like, there's nothing to this. I mean, we do this every day and there's nothing to it. You're going to be out of there in a couple of hours and be sitting over there eating ice cream in the hospital room and go home the next day. Ain't going to be any problem whatsoever. Well, that may be true too. But I told somebody, I said, I was ready to die when I was 18 years old. I'm not worried about that right now. Now, how, I told the doctor, how, that may be a different story. But being ready to leave this world has not been a problem for me since I was 16, 17 years old. And then when I received Christ, I've been ready to go since then. As a matter of fact, sometimes, like Paul said, it might be a little better to be out of this place and be with him than around here right now at some point in time. But now, grace is illustrated in the life of Mephibosheth. Now, I spent a lot of time, and this is what I'm hoping you do. That's the reason I'm covering this so fast. I would spend a lot of time driving, and hours on end across the state, and I would meditate on this, and I would retell this story over and over in my mind. I would just think about it. And so I'm hoping that you would take this story and just keep thinking about it and thinking about the different things in this story of Mephibosheth, because you just keep thinking about it and keep meditating on it, actually for hours on end if you want to, and just think about how God loves you and what God has done for you. Now, just a brief word on Mephibosheth. Now, there's two Mephibosheths in the history of Saul. One is down there to the far right. There's a Mephibosheth that was from Saul's concubine, Rizpah. Now, all those over there on that right side, all those men died. I don't know if you remember the story of the Gibeonites. There was a famine in the land for 3 years, and they went to David, and David went and asked, why are we having this famine? He said, because Saul violated the covenant that we had with the Gibeonites. And he asked the Gibeonites, what do you want to do? He said, we'll be satisfied if you give us 7 sons of Paul and we can kill them. Then the curse will be lifted and the famine will be over. And David said, okay, you can take 5 of them. So they took those 5 guys there plus the 5 sons of Merab, his daughter, and they killed them, and the famine was lifted. Now, that will require some thinking on our parts to figure out why all that took place. But God held Saul accountable for violating the covenant with the Gibeonites. Now, Mephibosheth, over there to the far left, he was the other Mephibosheth. He was the son of Jonathan. Now, he was saved. David said, I'm not going to let Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, go. But you can have those other 7 guys, but not Jonathan's son. I'm going to spare him. And so Mephibosheth was spared, but the other 7 guys, they were taken. That all happened in 2 Samuel 21. And there's several things that go on there that kind of we scratch our head over. But any rate, now what happened to Jonathan and David back in 1 Samuel 20, Jonathan and David, their last meeting that they had just before David ran off to escape Saul, Jonathan said, I want you to promise me one thing. When you become king, I know you're going to become king, and I'm asking you not to kill all of my descendants when you become king, and show kindness to my descendants. And David said, yes, I will show kindness to your descendants. Now, we all know stories of history where kings would kill all their children, all their brothers and sisters, and anybody else that was a threat to the king. That's common history knowledge. Even in the Old Testament, the kings would kill the relatives that they thought were a threat to their kingdom, to the throne. And David said, okay, I promise you that I will not eliminate all your blood relatives who could be a threat to my kingdom. So that was when the promise was made. Now, what happened to Mephibosheth is in 2 Samuel 4:4, when the nurse of Mephibosheth found out that Saul, Jonathan, and his other brother were all killed in Jezreel. Word got back to her. Well, she obviously thought that the children of Jonathan and Saul were going to be killed, so she picked up Mephibosheth and took off running. Well, the boy was 5 years old, and somehow or another he fell. Now, some people, one person I read said he fell off a horse. I have no idea if he fell off a horse or a mule or off a chariot or whatever, however happened, but I don't know if she was carrying him and then dropped him. But at any rate, he fell and he was crippled. in his legs, a result of that fall. Now, a situation happened to me in northeast Brazil. I was driving in this city, and they have these roundabouts. They call them balloons there. And this was a real busy one. I mean, it had 3 lanes going around. And you had to get in and get out. Well, it was like bumper cars to get in and get out. It was hot. And you know how hot black asphalt can get. Well, I saw this lady and her 2 kids there were running across the street there, those 3 lanes high. Well, this little baby was smaller than 5 years old, but she dropped him. Bam, he hit that hot asphalt and kind of bounced and kind of picked him back up. And I was probably as close from here to that wall, or maybe even closer when I came around, and she just got back. And the baby was on her shoulders looking back towards me. I had the most, awful, hurt look, crying face. I still frozen in my mind how that little kid was just in such agony. But they had to move. They didn't have time to stop. They had to keep moving, or they got run over on that road, because the car's not going to slow down. And so, but that just kind of visualized what happened here with Mephibosheth when he fell. Well, I'm not going to be able to read, or I could, but I'm not going to take the time to read all of 2 Samuel 9, 1 through 13. This is the story of David when he said, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Is there anybody left? Now, I've tried to figure out how long this happened. Saul was killed somewhere around when David was about 30. That's when he became king. He was in Hebron for a few years, and then he conquered Jerusalem and back there. So my best guess, ways I can look online to see the timeline of it, David was probably close to 40, 45 years old, maybe 15 years later after this happened. And he said, "Is there anybody left of the house of Saul that I can show kindness for the sake of David, sake of Jonathan?" And a fellow named Ziba, he said, "Well, Ziba's here." So they called in this guy named Ziba. And he said, "Yes, there's one fellow left. Best we can tell, there's one guy left. And his name is Mephibosheth. And he lives in the land of Lodebar." Now that, we talk about being on the wrong side of the tracks. Sometimes we have that expression. They live on there, that's the wrong side of the tracks. Well, in that day, it was the wrong side of the river. It was the wrong side of the Jordan River. You look at Jerusalem, due east, you cross the Jordan River, and you're in this area called Lodebar. And Lodebar means the land of no bread. He lived in a deserted area. Some people call this a slum. There's different words that are used, but he lived in the most poverty-stricken place across the river that you can imagine. That's where Mephibosheth went off to live. Abject poverty. And in that day and time, there was no social security, no social net. I mean, a fellow that was paralyzed with nothing to help. He had lived in a borrowed house. Well, now we come back to Ziba. Now this is where it gets a little bit of an illustration here of the work of the Holy Spirit. Ziba. He went out there, he took the king's chariot, and he headed across the river to find Mephibosheth. Now this is where, when it says God said that David had a heart after God's own heart. Now we all know all the problems that David had and all the sin and everything. But this is where I believe it says that David had a heart after God's own heart. Because he forgave his enemies, and he went to seek the ones that were unsociable, that were untouchable. And he got out there. Now, here's what Ziba did. Ziba walked in there. Can you imagine the entourage? Here's Ziba. He's coming out there with the king's chariots, king's horses, king's men, and they're going to the most abject, poverty-stricken city in the whole country. And he crossed over the river, and he winds up in front of the house of Mephibosheth. And you can imagine the noise that was going on in the city. What in the world is the king's chariot, the king's horses, the king's soldiers, the king's men, all doing in front of the house of Mephibosheth? Nobody goes to Mephibosheth. It is person non grata. You stay away from that place. There's nothing there. He is totally helpless. He can't do anything. He is useless to everybody. Nobody asks Mephibosheth for anything. He is the most useless person on the face of the earth here in this town. What in the world would the king want with him? Now, that is how God's love comes from us. When God's love comes to us, when you get right down to it, what can we do for God? I'll tell you in a minute what we can do, but it's useless. So he picked up Mephibosheth, and he put Mephibosheth in the king's chariot. He didn't walk in and say, Mephibosheth, I need a little help here. Can you help me get you up? When God saved us, he didn't need any help. He didn't help us at all. We didn't say, God, if you'll help me move a little bit, I'll do the rest of it. If you just get me started, I think I can finish it up. If you can do 90%, I think I can do the other 10% of salvation. Can't do it all. It's not 99% and me 1%. It's 100% God. And I tell you, that's the greatest day you ever had. Greatest day I ever had. When God reached down and picked me up, put me in the king's chariot. He cleaned them up. I'm going to run through this real quick. He cleaned them up. Obviously, he wasn't in any position to be before the king. He cleaned them up. He restored all the land that he had from King Saul, and he set at the king's table. Now that's what God did for us. He picked us up, put us in the king's chariot, and gave us back everything we lost in Adam. Got it all back. Now we're not possessing of it all right now, but we got it all back. And he sat at the king's table from then on. And we're sitting at the king's table from now on too. We're sitting at the king's table. Now that's the reason I have such a hard time with this story. Because it reminds me of me. Now, I wasn't raised in abject poverty, I know that. But as far as me doing anything to get in the king's chariot, there was nothing there. No way. And that just a little bit helps us understand the love of God. Well, 1 minute left, so it didn't take as long as I looked longer than I thought. But you can tell I haven't scratched the surface. I haven't. Anybody have any comment?
You need to be so much more aware of that every day. So much more aware of how privileged we are.
Now there is one thing. In John 17, Jesus said, I am glorified in them. I'm glorified in them. Now how does God get glory out of us? God gets glory for His grace and His love. He doesn't get glory out of something we, quote, do for Him. But He does get glory from demonstrating His great love towards us and His great grace towards us. He gets glory out of that. That glorifies Him. when we recognize, we don't have to even, that's the reason there's so much in the Bible about giving thanks. We just thank the Lord for what he's done. His mercies are new every morning. And so, there's a lot of questions I know about this passage, different things that, one of the other minor thing, well, not minor thing, but, you think about poor old Mephibosheth falling and being crippled there at the beginning. But if you stop and think about it, if he hadn't have been crippled, he most likely would have been killed as a threat to the king of Israel. Now, the people that killed this other fellow, they weren't sent there by David. They were David's friends, thinking that they're going to do David. We did you a favor, David. We killed this fellow that could be a threat to you. David said, I didn't want you to kill him. But he had a lot of friends that were killing people that they thought was a threat to David. And so if Mephibosheth hadn't have been crippled, he probably would have been killed somewhere along the way. So that disaster that happened to him was probably, or I'm pretty sure it was, a backhanded disaster, a backhanded blessing that kept him alive long enough for God to use this story to demonstrate an illustration of God's love.